Jule and Tashidelik. It's a real joy to be with you this afternoon. This is my second time to Ladakh. I first came here in 2010. In fact, just a few days after the tragic flash floods. It was a very different Ladakh then. But even then, as a Tibetan, someone who has never been to Tibet, there was something about Ladakh that really touched me. And perhaps it is this rugged landscape with this amazing openness, and then these dramatically vertical rocky mountains around, and dotted with monasteries perched often on top of a mountain. There was something about Ladakh that really touched my heart, and at that time I realized the reason why His Holiness the Dalai Lama loved to go to Ladakh every year. So once again, it's a real joy here. When I was asked to give a talk, I chose this topic particularly thinking of younger audience, but young is relative. So I suppose compared to me, most of you are young. I chose this partly because we are living in quite a complex world. We often forget that the today's contemporary world is a very different world from, our parents' generation. Like my own parents, they were Tibetan refugees, but at that time, when I was growing up and I studied at Kandan Monastery, I remember the world is looking back. It was quite simple. There wasn't internet. There wasn't, of course, no cellular facilities, and in the monasteries we did not even have, TV access to TV and all of this. So there was very little distraction. But today, particularly the younger generation, are living at a time when, every corner, wherever you look, it's constantly trying to grab your attention. So in this day and age, I feel particularly kind of sad for the parents who are trying to raise their children in this very complicated world where, in some sense, you don't really have much control over what your children become exposed to. And in this time, I think it is very important for us Buddhists to really appreciate what we have in Buddhism that really gives us the ability to not only develop ourselves a resilient mind, but in fact, if you are parents, find a way to instill that kind of resilience in your children, because otherwise, in this contemporary world, most people will actually live their life in a very reactive manner. You're constantly reacting, and then there's so much stimulation, and also, especially in the social media age, everybody is kind of advertising what is going well in their life. And then those who are consuming only see good part of someone enjoying life and start to feel that somehow something is wrong with your life because everybody seems to be having a good time. Why am I not enjoying? And this kind of comparison, in fact, scientists, psychologists have recognized quite early on one of the sources of suffering in the contemporary world is what they call social comparison. And social comparison is something that we humans can't resist. We will do it. Even in a village, you might know your parents will talk about so-and-so has a big house, so-and-so is going to be successful, so-and-so's child has gone to the United States. Social comparison is something that we humans, we do anyway. There's a Tibetan saying, to la takto, envy for those who are more successful, nyamba la densen, competition towards those who you see as equal, and memba la So you kind of have a contempt towards those, who you see as below. That's a very samsaric mindset. And we Tibetans and Ladakhis are no exception. Unless you consciously bring Dharma as part of your thinking, as human beings, we're going to respond. We're going to react in this social comparison way. But the problem with social comparison today is the comparison that you are going to make is way bigger. Everybody has a bullhorn to advertise what they would like the world to see. And then they express their opinion, but there is very little communication. So in this kind of world, unless we bring Dharma and take charge of your own life and live consciously, the recipe for sadness, suffering, misery, depression is all there. So I think here, those who have, as part of our heritage, spirituality in general, and particularly Buddhism, we really have an advantage. And I don't mean to say that Buddhism is the best, but because Buddhism, unlike other traditions, have a long history of paying attention on the development of the mind, meditation techniques, mental training techniques, calming the mind, emotion regulation, development of emotional awareness, all of these have been part of the long history of Buddhism. Therefore, someone like His Holiness, when he travels across the world, and I had the privilege to translate for him, he's not spreading Buddhism, but he's spreading the insights and the practices and the techniques for living a more peaceful life, happier life to the broader world. And some of you here may be familiar, he uses the word secular ethics, approach of secular ethics. It's an attempt to develop a universal language and present the key insights and techniques from Buddhism in a language and format that is not necessarily tied to specifically Buddhist kind of framework like karma or rebirth or devotion to Buddha. Those are very specifically Buddhist religious aspects, but the mental training exercises, the insights into the human psychology and human behavior, those are universal insights. And he really is keen to share them. So I think, Ladakhis and Tibetans who are historically have access to this heritage, I think it is important to recognize that and take pride. So what I thought I would do here is to really I'm not going to go into the details because you have the privilege of having access to so many lamas here, so many geshes who will give you the traditional teachings. But what I thought I would do is to identify some key aspects of Buddha's teaching which may be of direct relevance in our day-to-day life. Now, one of the key ideas in Buddhism is the idea of you are your own master. This, I think, is a very, very important point because what it is saying is that you need to take charge of your own well-being. So relying on others, depending on conditions getting right until you become happy is not a very good strategy, but you should be able to exercise mastery over your own self. So there's a very famous line saying that you're your own master, and for that very reason, you can be also your worst enemy. So I think this is a very simple idea, but it is also a very important one. And there is a beautiful line in the Dhammapada. Now, younger generation of Buddhists, we really have to follow His Holiness's advice when he says we should be 21st century Buddhists. The reason what he is saying here is that traditionally our parents, our grandparents, in their time, the world was simpler, Then they had deep devotion and reverence to their tradition. Then devotion, teba, devotion, faith alone can take you very far. But we, the younger generation, he's saying that our approach to Dharma should not be based just on faith. It should be based on understanding. And that understanding has to be grounded in something that you have personally experienced. Because if you personally experience the benefit of the Dharma, you're going to have more conviction. So there is a Tibetan expression called, Shene Teba Toba, which means to obtain faith on the basis of understanding. That is what His Holiness means when he says 21st century Buddhist. So don't leave your Dharma practice and Buddhist practice simply on the basis of saying Kyapso Che. So Kyapso Che is good, but for younger generation, Kyapso Che alone is not good enough, because our faith may not be as strong as those of our ancestors. And that is a fact. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to acknowledge. But on the other hand, we also have more advantage compared to the older generation. Because the older generation, I'm sure the Ladakh is the same in the Tibetan tradition, the older generations, unless you're a monastic member, most of them were not literate. They did not read. They did not study texts. They were only receiving teachings and blessings. They go to visit temples. They light a candle lamp. It's butter lamp. So that was the kind of approach. But in the younger generation now, even if we don't read Chosket, the Tibetan classical text, but many of the texts are in English. So we have no excuse to say, I can't read. So I think it's important for us, younger generation, to take advantage that we have, which the elder generation did not have, which is the access to these texts in a language that we ourselves understand. And here, I particularly emphasize the English because there's a very long history now of translation of Buddhist texts into English. And also the language in English, the Dharma language, is fairly well standardized. And, I speak both Tibetan and English, and I'm a big admirer of English as a language. It's a very versatile language. It's a very practical language. And it's also quite a beautiful language. So Dharma, some people say, if you don't read Dharma in Tibetan, you're not getting the real thing. Translations, English is a European language, and you can't understand Dharma in English. I don't agree with that. In fact, Tibetan is a translation. Original Buddha did not teach in Tibetan, So Tibetan Kangyuru and Tengyuru were all translated from Sanskrit or Pali. So I'm a believer, maybe I have to believe this because I work by doing translation, so if I don't believe the translatability of languages. But there is this idea by Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American writer, who says that any important insight into human experience and human nature in one language should be translatable in another language. And I truly agree, because in the end, language is a symbol. Language is a symbol through which human experience is communicated. Buddha happened to speak in one language, but in Buddhism, we don't really believe in a sacred language per se, because language is only a medium through which the truth is communicated. So whether the truth is communicated through Tibetan or English or French or German or Hindi should not really matter. So I think for younger generation, I think there is a lot of access in English. And those who speak English and read English well and consider yourself Buddhist, each of you really need to have a copy of the Dhammapada, okay? This is something if there's one thing that you're going to remember from my talk today, remember that as an English-speaking Buddhist, have a copy of the Dhammapada. Dhammapada is one of the most important texts which is universal to all Buddhist traditions. Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, all the traditions will accept the validity and authenticity of Dhammapada. So in Dhammapada, there is a beautiful verse where the Buddha says that just as the water canal makers are expert in drawing the water in different directions, just as a carpenter is expert at molding the tree, and just as the arrow maker, uses heat to straighten the arrow, in the same way, a wise person will, gain mastery over himself or herself. So this is Danyi Tulwa, or, self-mastery. This is really key. And what does self-mastery mean? It means disciplining your mind. So sen tulua. This is really a key idea. And there's a beautiful line where the Buddha says that, by disciplined mind lead to happiness, and disciplined mind is true peace. So the key point is, in Buddhism, the primacy, the primary importance of mind is a very important teaching of the Buddha. Because in the end, of course we have the body, but when we interact with the world, the most of our problems are really coming from our mind, not really the body. The body problems are more easily solved, unless you have a major physical illness, then it's a different thing. But most of our suffering is really in the mind. And how we respond to situation in our life really is dependent on our mind. So in a sense, mind is the gateway through which we interact with the world, interact with the people in our life, interact with ourselves as well, how you see yourself. All of this is really coming from the mind. So if you are able to discipline your mind, calm your mind, it creates a completely different experience. Two people may be experiencing the same thing, they may be living in the same neighborhood, socioeconomic status, everything, but these two individuals may be experiencing the world completely differently, depending on what their mindset is. So in Buddhism, one of the most important kind of issues is developing your mind in such a way that you have the right kind of view in relation to yourself and the world, so that you don't really exaggerate, you don't misperceive reality. So there is this, there's a great Tibetan master, a Kadamba teacher. He's talking about, very intensive hermit practice, of course, which can be a little radical for us. But the point is an important one. He says, as a meditator, he says he has got only one job. He says that is to constantly guard his mind. And then if afflictions like attachment and anger arises, I pay attention and remain guard. If attachment and anger and these afflictions are not arising, he says, I relax. So you can get this idea that he says that in fact for a meditator, the most important job is to simply observe your mind. And this is a key point, because in the end, whether our experience lead to suffering or happiness is a function of mind. So often His Holiness says that so it means happiness or suffering, whether you go into which direction, is really up to the state of mind, whether the state of mind is disturbed or state of mind is peaceful. So I think this state of mind, the role of the state of mind, the centrality of that is a really key Buddhist teaching, which I think is, even though it was the Buddha who said it, but there is nothing uniquely Buddhist about it. Anybody, whether you have a specific faith or no faith, can take that insight. So that I think is an important point. And then then the question is, how do we do this? Now today, some of you may be familiar. In the West, the mindfulness movement is everywhere. Not just among ordinary people, but also mindfulness is in the healthcare, is in the management training, is in teacher training, school systems, and everywhere. And the key idea of mindfulness is the ability to step back and watch your mind, watch your thoughts, watch your emotions. And here what is happening is that often, we are so reactive in our experience that we don't step back and notice what is happening. So the mindfulness is proving to be very beneficial because it is teaching people a skill to be able to step back and then watch your thoughts. So many of the problems in our mind, for example, if you are having a disagreement or argument with one of your colleagues. So disagreements are always going to be there in human, when you have more than two people, it is a crowd. When there is a crowd, you're going to have a different opinion. So, but then after having a discussion, if your mind gets busy, start thinking, oh, she said that, I don't know exactly why she said, maybe she was angry because I said this. The mind starts spinning the wheel, okay? Now, if you let your mind spin the wheel, you don't know where it's going to go. This is what is called rumination, okay? And rumination is one of the sources of suffering. So in fact, often when your mind is ruminating, it's often about yourself. It's really a story about yourself. And when you pay too much attention thinking about yourself, that's where most of the problems are. Because there's a Tibetan Lama who said that those who are too much focused on themselves are vulnerable, and they are like someone who's carrying a big target on their back who can be hit from many different directions. So basically, when you are too obsessed about yourself, you become not very resilient. You become fragile. And we know people in our life whose ego are quite fragile, easily get hurt. So this is one area where I think the mind's role becomes very obvious. So in the Theravada teaching, there is this very beautiful concept, powerful concept of the second arrow. So physical illness, financial struggles, relationship breakdowns, all of these are part of human experience, okay? So those are immediate circumstances that give rise to pain. So that's the first arrow, okay? The second arrow is then you start spinning story yourself. And then saying, oh, why me? I'm such a loser. Of course, nobody loves me. What was I thinking that I could achieve this? So you start spinning all of this. Those are additional problems you're bringing yourself. And often, the biggest problems are not really the first arrow. It's really the second arrow. So I think in Buddhism, this whole teaching on the observing the mind is a suggestion to us. You can train yourself so that you don't suffer from the second arrow. And I think that is doable. What it requires is the ability to pay attention and bring intention into the situation. And furthermore, for Mahayana Buddhists, one of the important teaching, in addition to observing your mind and paying attention, being mindful, is bringing conscious intention of compassion. So this is, of course, in Theravada Buddhism, compassion is there because the four immeasurables are there. But Mahayana tradition seems to be particularly, emphasize the compassionate kind of, for example, in the Tibetan tradition, we do the chanting of the four immeasurables, like Samjen Tamjen Dewada, Dewajudan Tembaruji. We do the chanting, but when it comes to actual training of the mind, the focus is really on compassion. And the idea is that loving kindness is the opening of the heart. So it's the initial basis. Compassion is the actual cultivation of the heart, because compassion is the most powerful motivation. And sympathetic joy is more of an expression of compassion, because if you are truly compassionate, then you are not going to be jealous of someone else's success. You're going to actually rejoice. So rejoicing or sympathetic joy is more of an expression. Also, it's a kind of a additional tool to deal with jealousy and envy. And equanimity is a state that comes out of loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, because equanimity is higher quality where you have attained such an equilibrium that things that are happening around you does not disturb you too much. Okay? So the four immeasurables are shared both in Theravada and Mahayana tradition, but in the Mahayana tradition, when it comes to actual training of the mind and cultivation, the focus is really on compassion. And the compassion, the idea here is that And this is one of the reasons why we also know that His Holiness, when he teaches internationally to secular audience, in addition to talking about the importance of awareness and mindfulness, he will also bring compassion. Now there is a lot of research that is being brought that shows the power of compassion, and one of the major contributions His Holiness has made is to help develop a more universal language around compassion. Because in the old days, compassion was seen more as a religious value. So the teaching on compassion was embedded in religion or morality. But His Holiness's genius has been to take compassion out of religion and even morality and ground it in our understanding of basic human nature. And this is one of the reasons why he talks about how, as social animals, capacity to care for someone, empathize with someone comes very naturally. And especially he cites the example of mother-child bonding. And recently I was with His Holiness last October, actually March. I was in Dharamsala, and there was a group of two separate groups. One was a group of Dalai Lama fellows from University of Colorado, Boulder, and University of Virginia, Charlottesville, and Stanford University. Group of young scholars from them called the Dalai Lama Fellows. They had an audience with His Holiness, and then after that there was a group from Harvard talking about happiness. And the central message that His Holiness shared with these two groups was that we humans, both at the individual as well as the group level, so long as we don't forget that we come from a mother. Our first experience was that of being nurtured and cared for. So long as we don't become alienated from that nature, he said, the world will be okay. Humanity will be okay. It's a simple idea, but it's a powerful one. What he's saying is that, in the past, in the West particularly, because of, the influence of, Darwinian evolutionary theory, there was an understanding that the fundamental driver of human behavior was selfishness, pursuit of self-interest. So science had a problem finding a place for emotions like compassion or empathy, because somehow it doesn't go well with the basic idea that we are profit maximizers, we are driven by pursuit of self-interest. But now, even in evolutionary science, there has been a revolution. Now, very few scientists will question the reality of compassion and empathy and altruism. When you see empathy in non-human primates, then you cannot argue empathy and compassion are constructs of religion and morality, because you cannot say there's religion among animals, So the evidence for the reality of empathy and compassion among animals really powerfully demonstrate that it has to be important part of who we are as human beings. And I think increasingly there is now a recognition, and now because of this, there are secular programs being developed, such as my own at Stanford, and then my colleague Shilomsan Tenzin Neki has developed one at Emory. So there are other secular, similar kind of compassion trainings, and these are increasingly showing that that once you go through this training, it actually creates a much more resilient mind. So I'll just cite one, kind of study. There was an important study done in Denmark among a very specific population referred to as informal caregivers. So these are ordinary people who have mentally challenged family members at home, and parents have to look after them 24/7. Okay? Just imagine how stressful that must be. So these are referred to as informal caregivers. So among them, they were divided randomly into two groups of 30-30, and then they were tested on various things. And then one group was exposed to the compassion training, the other group was exposed to some other program, and then compared. And then, the second group also got the training afterwards, but not for this particular period. And then those who went through the 8-week training, it's a 2-hour once a week includes combination of meditation, guided practice, discussion, and a little bit of lecture. After 8 months, they were tested again, and the major outcome measure they used is what is called depression, anxiety, and stress scale. It's a DAS, DASS. So those who were able to go through the training, showed significant difference on this particular score, and they checked after 3 months and 6 months, and the effects were still present after 3 and 6 months. So what this suggests is that, even those who are informal caregivers who are constantly exposed to, suffering family members, when they go through this kind of training, it makes them stronger and be with the suffering in a way. So I think there is something about compassion. His Holiness says that when you're truly compassionate in a given situation, you are braver because there is no self-hidden agenda. You can be more transparent. So I think those are, there's now a beginning of an understanding of the power of compassion. And one of the most, important points about compassion is that it is part of the motivation. We can choose. We can choose anger, jealousy, competitiveness as part of our motivation. But we can also choose kindness and compassion. But choosing kindness and compassion does not mean, you are weak. If anything, choosing compassion and kindness is stronger, because responding to a challenge in anger is actually quite easy. Because we're so used to anger, because reacting in an angry way is actually easier. Choosing patience, choosing compassion and kindness is more challenging. But on the other hand, when you choose it, then the consequences of that interaction is completely different. So I think here, again, the Mahayana Buddhism's teaching on the importance of compassion is an important part of everyday way of thinking. Again, it comes from the Mahayana Buddhism, but there's nothing that says non-Buddhists cannot adopt it. This is the beauty of these teachings. They are coming from kind of Buddhist sources, but their appeal and applicability is universal. So in addition to paying attention, bringing awareness into situation, cultivating a good intention is an important part of, taking charge, being more conscious in your life. So intention setting is an important part. Just before we came down, we were upstairs, and in that, reception room, there were some beautiful calligraphies on the wall with the images of the Buddha and Manjushri and so on. And in one of the images, in the halo, there was this beautiful verse from Tsongkhapa written there, which says, some of you may be familiar, Karna lenam sampa sangela. Good and bad karma are functions of good and bad intention. When the intention is good, everything is good. When the intention is bad, everything is bad. Therefore, everything depends upon your intention. So we're talking about those who want to be spiritual. Now, of course, if you don't care, that's something else. But I think it shows the power of intention. So in practical terms, how do we do this? So this is where I think the Tibetan tradition is very, very beautiful. Tibetan tradition has a lot of resources, and one of the important source of collection of teachings that is shared across all the major traditions in the Tibetan Buddhism is the Kadam teachings on Lojong, mind training. And mind training is today, because there is no Kadamba, card-carrying Kadamba members, there's Kadamba got absorbed into Giluk and Sakya, but the Kadam teachings are now universal, particularly the Lojong. And the Lojong is another set of teachings that I think the younger generation could really benefit from, sort of constantly cultivating. So in addition to Dhammapada, the second text that you need to have is the source of Lojong teachings is Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way. Okay, so Guide to the Bodhicharya Avatara, there's no excuse not to read this text because there are tons of English translations. My favorite one is the one that was done by a team, couple, and was published by Oxford University Press in the World Classics series. It's a slim volume. So the Tibetan Lojong teachings were all primarily developed from Shantideva's texts. And in the Tibetan Lojong, some of you are familiar these days. There is the phrase of, Lojong slogans. In the Tibetan tradition, we don't use the language of slogans, but the modern teachers are using the language of slogans, which I think is a good one, because they are very catchy aphorisms. So there are 61 or 59 or 61 of them, and the intention part is a powerful one, which says that there are two tasks, one at the beginning and one at the end. And this is a beautiful teaching, because what it is saying is that if you are serious about your Dhamma practice, you need to pay attention at the beginning, setting your intention. You set your good intention, and then at the end, you round it up by ngoa, dedication, or rejoicing, gaogomba. And this is a beautiful instruction even in your daily life. For example, if you're going to have a difficult conversation with a colleague, a hard talk that you need to have, or maybe your teenage kid, that you're going to say, okay, we need to have a chat. So when you're going to have a challenge, using this method of first connecting with your intention and setting your intention, you just don't barge in and shout. You set your intention and then show up, have a conversation. When you finish, don't just move on, reflect on it, and then rejoice. Okay? So this is Lojong. The Lojong instruction is frame your daily life. So you set your intention in the morning. If you're struggling with your anger, so you can say, okay, today I'm going to be less angry. I'm going to be a bit more mindful. I'm going to be a little bit kinder. Whatever intention you set in the morning, at the end, and setting your intention doesn't take very long. So this is one thing. When we talk about Dhamma practice, don't have the idea of extreme, okay? If you're going to be practice, I should be sitting down for 1 hour or 40 minutes or closing my eyes. That's asking too much, okay? So just be practical. If you can't find much time, set aside 5 minutes in the morning or 10 minutes in the morning. Nobody can say, I don't have 5 minutes in the morning, okay? Especially if you are spending a couple of minutes or watching YouTube or whatever, then you can tell yourself that at least, yes, I can get 5 minutes in the morning. Set your intention, and at the end of the day, before going to bed, find another 5 minutes, quickly review the day, and see how much synergy there is between the spirit of the morning intention setting and the reality of that day. And wherever you have had success, it is important to rejoice, gaogomba. Okay? So in the Buddhist tradition, there is a lot of emphasis placed on joy, rejoicing. Because if you're not enjoying, it becomes a chore, it becomes a struggle. And if you're constantly struggling, at one point you're going to give up. That's very human nature. But even if it is hard, if you find a little success here and success there, you rejoice, and then the joy sets a different kind of energy and tone, and then you're more likely to do it again. So, and here Buddhism is bringing a very important psychological insight. Because when you want to do something, initially your motivation can be pushed by will. Just simple sheer force of your will. Okay, you can get into something. So for example, if you want to learn how to play a guitar, so you pick up the instrument and you just will yourself. But the will alone is not going to get you far. Okay? Now, the question is, how do you sustain your motivation? At some point, if you can bring an element of joy, so for example, like learn a few simple songs, okay? Memorize it, play it, then you enjoy yourself. You're actually saying, oh my God, I'm doing it. So when you get that joy, then the motivation sustains. So I think in Dharma practice it's the same thing. So that's why His Holiness often tells younger people that you have to make Dharma relevant to your life. You have to see the power of Dharma in your own life. But when you see the power, then you're more likely to keep it going. So I think, yes, as Buddhists, we have to have devotion. We have to revere all the great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of the past. But in the end, the Dharma teaching has to be real in your life. And there, I think many of the teachings of His Holiness are powerful, talking about books. So I said Dhammapada, I said Shantideva. There is a beautiful book by His Holiness, small one, called Transforming the Mind. Okay, so I think in addition to Dhammapada and Bodhicharya Avatara, you need to have that book by His Holiness. There's an Indian edition. It is based on a lecture that he gave in London, a series of lectures on the 8 verses of mind training. So these things will really help you make Dharma real in your life. So once you are able to make Dharma real in your life, then you have a kind of a self-confidence and also a resilience. I mean, in the Lojong there is a line which says that whatever you encounter right now, bring it into your practice. Now, if you take that seriously, then whether it is illness or tragedy or adversity or failure, you apply for a job, you don't get it, or a good fortune, you win something, whatever you encounter, if you are serious, you can bring it into your practice. So I think this kind of ability to have this amazingly resilient mind which can accept both good fortune and misfortune is a beautiful one. Because if you can handle both, then you are truly quite powerful actually. Because sometimes people can't handle success. It goes to their head. They become arrogant. And when you are arrogant, you start thinking, oh, I'm so special. And then you start looking down on others. That's a problem. But then sometimes when you have misfortune, you sort of move in the opposite direction of self-pity, defeating yourself, thinking that, oh, I'm no good. Again, that is a problem. But if you are a good Dharma practitioner, you can take both. And once you are able to take both good misfortune and a good fortune, then there is nothing that is going to destabilize you. I mean, of course, as a human being, you're going to swing. When there is a disappointment, you're going to get sad. That is a human response. But sadness is not going to lead to depression. That's where the problem is. If you are successful, your child is successful, you will be happy. But that happiness is not going to lead to arrogance. So that is the true mark of a Dharma practitioner. It doesn't really matter whether you have a big title like Rinpoche or Geshe or whatever, but each of us can make Dharma real in our own life. Then there is a beautiful saying by Atisha. He says, whether be it hostile or friendly, any situation that normally give rise to strong negative emotions, anyone who can take that experience as a teaching, that person is happy, no matter where he or she lives. I mean, that is doable. When you are able, this is the power of Dharma practice. So I wanted to, I'm not going to talk about a traditional approach to Dharma. I'm talking more to you from a kind of contemporary approach to Dharma. And that's partly because, I chose to live a contemporary life. I live in the West, just you have to pay your bill, you have to make your living, whatever. But I've found in my everyday life, in my parenting, in my work, some of these teachings from Dharma are really powerful. And of course, once in a while, if you can also set aside to do a little bit of retreat, especially for calming the mind, those things take a little bit of time. You cannot do it just by 5 minutes every day. So once in a while, if you can choose to take like a week or 3 day, do a silent retreat, there might be Vipassana centers here. The Vipassana centers tend to be really good for silent retreats. Then the beauty of that is you will get a taste of what it feels like to experience this quiet, silent mind. So once in a while, I think that is also helpful. So in conclusion, what I want to do was to really kind of share with you that I'm happy that there are so many of you here, who are interested in taking these insights and practices into your everyday life. Because sometimes I feel a little sad that many of the benefits of Dharma are being enjoyed internationally by educated, people in the West. Mindfulness, compassion training, loving kindness, emotional regulation, emotional awareness. But in my own community, the young people, the secular lay people are not really that interested, and they seem to be sometimes clueless. And this is sad, it's like there's nothing wrong with the Dharma being shared widely, but at the same time, one would hope that there's a Tibetan saying, a family members should appreciate the jewel they have. So that I think is important for us, Tibetans and Ladakhis. Tibetan tradition, Buddhism is our heritage. It is a jewel. It is being appreciated internationally, but if we don't appreciate, then it is our loss. So I think, especially for example, when it comes to emotion regulation, emotion awareness, and all of this, mindfulness, my wife is here and colleague, Danielle, they teach these in schools and teacher training, teaching teachers, they have some work here in the Stock school as well. But in the West, now even in, teacher training, those who are teaching, from K through 12, secular approach to emotional awareness and emotion regulation are now being taught as part of a teacher training. So when internationally there is so much appreciation and attention being paid to these skills, we ourselves don't appreciate this, then it's our own loss. So I'm really happy. And then before we came down, we had a lot of discussion with the key members who are part of the Ladakh Youth Association. One of the things that I said is that I would really like to see more and more younger generation really appreciate, because sometimes, especially the younger generation, I notice they are not very strong mentally. And, and then on top of that, the generational gap is happening, not just in Ladakh, among Tibetan community as well. And so increasingly, the traditional scaffolding of relationship that are protected, such as, younger generations' respect for their elders, Gembala Kushab, these things are gradually eroding, and then the younger generations become more and more alienated from their parents, and then they're, when I was growing up, it was unthinkable for a Tibetan child to be shouting back to their parents. We see that in the West, but in the Tibetan culture, but now increasingly we see that. So these are, of course, no culture can exist and survive in a cocoon. In today's globalized world, we are so interconnected, but at the same time, I think it is important for us to continue to hold on to what is the core, and then relate to the globalized world from a strength of the core rather than being pushed around. So I think here, younger generations, instead of the parents insisting that the younger generations follow exactly the traditional way, the smarter strategy would be to use some of these Buddhist techniques and show the value of Dharma in everyday life to the younger generation. Once they see the benefit, they will themselves take it more seriously. So I wanted to share this with you, and then maybe I'm sorry I spoke for a little too long, but we will have some Q&A. Thank you.